afternoon, everybody. This is Bill Wright from Sherman and Howard, and I'm here to present on Workplace Violence and HR Guide. And with me, as I'll mention here in a moment, is Carissa Davis. I hope all of you are able to access the system. I've been having a chat in the sidebar with Linda and Elizabeth, trying to make sure that everybody's able to get on board. This topic is workplace violence. I was especially excited to get this topic assigned to me by our practice group leader because it seems so very timely. It's every day now that we hear or read about a violent attack at a workplace, either for workplace reasons or for reasons having to do with personal disputes that carry over into the workplace. So this is a very timely topic and one that I was excited to address. Those of you who have seen me present live will know that I really like to work the room. People will see me running from one side of the room to the other with the microphone, trying to get people to talk to me. And that's going to be a real problem on this particular platform. I cannot run from room to room, and I can't even give you a microphone to talk. But this does seem like it's a topic where everybody's going to have a story, and the stories that you all would tell would be an important part of the entire presentation. I encourage you to use the chat box to talk to the rest of us who are here and tell us about your own experiences in these things. Our goal is to really focus on what HR should be doing about the prospect of workplace violence. And we don't want to just tell scary stories, though there certainly are plenty of scary stories. We want to talk about what HR should be doing, what you should be aware of, and what steps you ought to be taking now in advance of any such session. I was doubly pleased to learn that Carissa was going to present this with me. All of you will be familiar with Carissa from her morning presentation. But she is obviously a rising star in our group. She's the only associate that we gave an entire presentation to in the morning session, so you can see how much we value her input. And I was thrilled that she was able to correct and improve on my slides for this presentation. Our strategy here is to minimize the back and forth between the two speakers. And so Chris is actually going to lead the discussion for a while here until we get up to specific training items where I had specific ideas I wanted to discuss. So Carissa, welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Bill. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your break and some of the other presentations we've had today. I was eager to present on workplace violence as well. I think sometimes when you think about the topics that we present during these seminars, we think of discrimination, wage and hour issues, but the workplace violence issue, as Bill noted, is gaining increasing attention. And I think we all felt like we had a bit of a reprieve during COVID when many businesses were closed down. But as businesses start to reopen, we can see that violent encounters are increasing. And so let's talk a little bit about what workplace violence is, and we'll get into kind of defining the issue a little bit better too. But during this presentation, we're going to talk about the risk factors and the red flags. I think some of these risk factors and red flags are intuitive, and then some of them are not intuitive, but it's important to just speak through them so that we can, have them on the forefront of our minds as we start to reopen. We'll also talk about how to identify experts and resources so that you don't feel like you have to address this very heavy issue on your own. There are plenty of people that have resources and expertise in the area, and you can build upon that expertise in crafting your own policies. And of course, we'll be talking about policies and how you may wish to address and prevent or at least mitigate the risk of workplace violence. These policies can come in the form of education for employees, prevention, and reporting. And of course, we'll also talk about incident response in the unfortunate circumstance that a violent encounter does occur. Of course, all these policies will want to be continuously reviewed and revised. And as employers experience more potential circumstances that could result in workplace violence, then continuous review and revision will be important in order to ensure that we have the proper policies in place. So let's take a look at the issue on a high level. The National Safety Council reports that certain industries experience higher rates. This information is intuitive. I think a lot of us When we think about the workplace violent encounters that have occurred and are reported through the media, we see it in healthcare, education, and transportation. Retail workplace violence is on the rise. We've included two statistics here. 42% of retail workers reported facing exposure to workplace violence, and 41% of those workers said that they felt like they had a lack of proper training that could have contributed to serious workplace violence. And so these statistics are important, and they will inform the rest of the presentation today. And while these statistics illustrate what's happening in the retail industry now, I think that they're indicative of a broader trend of employee concerns on workplace violence, and certainly emphasize the need for employers to take into consideration their employees' feelings, concerns, and take action to address workplace violence. Some statistics on the side here illustrate the issue in 2018. I pulled 2018 because I thought it was more appropriate given the dip in business during COVID and the pandemic. I thought that this was probably a more comprehensive look on the state of workplace violence as all businesses were open and functioning. And so in 2018, workplace assaults resulted in about 20,000 injuries and 453 fatalities. Of those non-fatal workplace violent encounters, 70% of the incidents were directed at women. Now, one might think, why is there such a disparity for these nonviolent encounters? And I think that the statistic illustrates that when there are workplace shootings, mass shootings, either perpetrated by employees or customers coming onto the work site, oftentimes that shooting is indiscriminate, and the objective of the perpetrator is to cause as much damage as possible. Whereas individually targeted circumstances, say sourced from perhaps an abusive situation at home, those will be targeted more often than not towards women. And so I think that the non-fatal workplace violence statistic kind of illustrates just how workplace violence can occur, what the motivating factors are, and how it impacts different sectors of employees. So on a high level, let's just define this problem. I think throughout this presentation, you'll hear Bill and I speaking to workplace shootings because those are just the most horrific incidents of workplace violence. But the issue is not limited to physical encounters. Workplace violence can be defined broadly. It can include intimidation and threatening language, not just that physical assault or homicide. And throughout this presentation, we'll talk about why defining workplace violence broadly is so important, particularly in terms of defining those policies. And so when you're thinking about how you want your company to develop these policies to address workplace violence, it'll be important to determine the extent of management commitment. Are we in a position to where we can enact policies that address not only the physical assaults, but also intimidation and threatening language, those non-physical violent issues? Or is the company right now looking only to the physical violent encounters? My hope is that at the end of this presentation, you'll feel empowered to want to address the whole spectrum of violence in the workplace, not just those most horrific incidents. But in terms of defining the problem, we know it can be physical, it can be non-physical, and what are the relationships here where workplace violence encounters can occur? We've got worker on worker, customer on customer, not even involving employees, but occurring on the work site between customers. Criminal intent, I think that those are the workplace shootings that we refer to, and then personal relationships. We'll talk about personal relationships throughout this presentation. I think that that's a callback to the 70% statistic that we talked about earlier. Oftentimes, women are the victims of personal relationships resulting in violent encounters. And so that's another area where employers will want to enact policies to appropriately reduce the risk of that. So what are the known risk factors? OSHA has produced several known risk factors that can result in higher rates of violent encounters. That includes contact with the public, the exchange of money, working alone or in small numbers, working late at night or during the early morning hours, and community-based settings. And so when we talk about assessing the risk factors, for example, working late at night or during the early morning hours, there are other issues that will influence why this is an OSHA known risk factor. For example, proper locks and security, proper lighting. Those are all factors that we'll discuss later. But in terms of what OSHA defines as these are the known risk factors, these 4 are the most important that are noted. In terms of legal risk here, at the outset, I think we can all recognize that employers are concerned with workplace violence from an ethical stance, not just a legal stance. But legal risk is very real. Obviously, we're attorneys. This is what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So we have to inform about what the legal risks are in terms of how the employer takes action to prevent workplace violent encounters, and also how an employer responds to those violent encounters. So the first set of legal concerns we concern ourselves with is negligence. And so the negligence standard, what we want to do is look at employers taking reasonable steps to provide a safe and secure workplace for the employees. We'll talk about what defines reasonable steps, what OSHA looks for in reasonable steps, and how we can try to ensure that we enact policies that, are reasonable in terms of deterring those encounters. The negligence claims can also come on a failure to correct conditions that the employer knew or should have known about. Should have known about, that standard will be easier to meet if the employer has proper policies and record keeping in place. We'll talk about record keeping throughout this presentation, but an employer needs to surveil the area, ensure that they take reasonable steps to note problematic behavior, problematic relationships, and hopefully at the outset, mitigate the risk of negligence claims. There's also vicarious liability, where a supervisor's intentional conduct could be imputed to the employer, even if the employer does not take any, deliberate actions in and of themselves to result in violent encounters. There are elements of harassment and other discrimination claims that are at play here. For example, harassment and intimidation. Oftentimes in a hostile work environment context, the issues start seemingly menial or small, and then they progress. Oftentimes harassment is a progressive cycle, as I think many of us know with our experience with employees. So having proper policies in place to address harassment and intimidation before it results in a violent encounter. And we'll see how there are several risk factors in terms of employee obsession with one another, bullying. These can all, these are all precursors to what could result in a violent encounter. And of course, liability under OSHA as well. Okay, so we're going to go over 2 slides here about assessing specific risk factors. On this first slide, we're going to talk about the employer's actual physical location here. So who creates the risk? Public access versus employees. Earlier, we talked about how there are workplace violent encounters between customer to customer, employee to employee, or, between customers and employees. And one way that you can preclude public access to an area if, the concern is that the public will perpetrate violence is to ensure that we have proper locks and proxy access. Proxy access, I think, is preferable to just physical locks at times, because hopefully if the employer can have the ability to remotely lock down the facility or surveil those who are using their proxies to gain access to certain areas, then that can then the employer has an easier step to containing the threat if the perpetrator is an employee. Of course, if the perpetrator is a member of the general public, they're not going to have proxy access in order to enter different points of access. But of course, there are always ways where, people seeking to do harm can try to work around. But the more comprehensive the locks and the proxy access, the more that the employer can reduce the risk here. There are other physical circumstances that can result in increased risk. Lighting, population density, and areas of isolation are 3 of them. So earlier we talked about the OSHA factors of employees leaving late at night or early in the morning. Proper lighting will be absolutely crucial to ensuring that violent attackers are not laying in wait for employees to leave the workplace. Proper lighting is one of those things that an employer can show it took reasonable steps to provide a reasonably safe area. If there's no lighting and the back door is left open without a lock, and employees are leaving the workplace late at night, I think that, in some circumstances could show that the employer is not taking reasonable steps to provide a safe workplace. Population density, the more dense the population, just statistically, the more likely there's going to be, encounters that could turn violent. And then conversely, areas of isolation too, and those two may seem at odds, but, if it's somewhat intuitive, if you think about it, the areas of isolation may be areas where there could be premeditated attacks perpetrated upon individual employees. So the example I gave is an employee leaving the workplace, and then, there's insufficient lighting and a perpetrator is laying in wait. And then lastly, we have the availability of makeshift weapons, crowbars, things of the like. That's just going to be something that's based on the employer's individual business. So how can employers mitigate these risks? Ensuring that they have proper escape and evacuation routes, ensuring that communication structures are in place, ensuring there's surveillance and the ability to remotely lock down the facility. So these all play into one another, right? So we've got proper surveillance, which allows you to see the threat or the encounter if it's occurring, the ability to remotely lock down the facility, which is probably using proxy access or other electronic means to lock down a particular area. And in a perfect world, if a violent encounter does occur, then the employer could contain it within that particular area. But there are other risk factors not limited to the layout of the employer's business. And so one of the major risk factors is lack of pre-employment screening. Pre-employment screening, typically in the case of background checks, is incredibly important to ensure that the employer is taking reasonable steps to not employ someone who could potentially pose a danger to the workplace. There are, of course, some restrictions on when background checks are appropriate and applicable, and those restrictions change by state at times. But the pre-employment screenings may reveal some risk factors that the employer would, that may give pause to an employer in terms of ensuring that employee or allowing that employee to enter the work site. There are other workplace culture risk factors that that should be taken into consideration. Constant overtime stress and frustration and labor disputes are three of the culture issues. I think if there's one thing that the pandemic has shown us, it's that there is there's been a corresponding increase in customer bad behavior. So, for example, we think about the airline flights recently. I mean, there has been a statistically significant shift in airline flight bad behavior of people on the flights. And so I think that indicates that when people are stressed and they're frustrated, they'll lash out. And I think that emerging out of the pandemic, a lot of people are stressed and frustrated. And so to the extent that the workplace culture causes that stress and frustration, whether it be through labor disputes, overtime, or other reasons, that's a major risk factor. And how do you determine whether or not the workplace has these risk factors? I think surveys are probably a good way to go about it. I think the surveys need to be anonymous. I think employees are less likely to be forthcoming if their name is attached to it. But anonymous surveys may be a way to glean some insight into the employee concerns. I mean, think back to those retail employee statistics that we thought about earlier. 41% of those employees don't feel like they've had the proper training. And then lastly, awareness of fraught situations, terminations, reductions in force, persistent grudges, and bullying. Obviously, terminations and rifts. I think that most employers, if an employee is terminated and they're displaying belligerent behavior, having someone on site to escort that employee off site, being aware that reductions in force may result in backlash. I think that those are also areas that could, be a fraught situation that would result in workplace violence when perhaps the workplace was seemingly cohesive before then. And then persistent grudges and bullying. These are two fraught situations that I think influence the harassment issues, the intimidation issues, and making sure that the employer is aware of, the human dynamics between different employees. So let's talk more about some specific red flags. Ominous and specific threats. I think that these kind of make sense to employers when we think about what are the red flags here. Also, homicidal and suicidal comments. Obviously, I think most employers would address the homicidal comments because those in our society seem to be easier to address. The suicidal comments are often challenging in terms of what an employer feels comfortable addressing, but it's still noted as a risk factor. Erratic and belligerent behavior, hypersensitivity to criticism. This may come in the form of performance reviews, to be aware of those types of behaviors. Recent assassination of weapons or obsession with a coworker, preoccupation with violence. These types of obsessive behaviors have been identified as these specific red flags. And then outbursts of anger as well. I think that feeds into the erratic behavior and belligerence. And so what do we like to see in terms of employer policies? As we noted earlier when we talked about the negligence, legal risks, we want to see employers take all reasonable steps. So that means we want clear policies on workplace violence, weapons, how to report threats, and how to react to an emergency. Bill's going to talk about all staff training, but it's important to have that staff training with a high executive buy-in. There's also, employers should also have policies on emergency communications, contacts, how employees should react to that emergency situation, site access controls. And then earlier we talked about background checks in terms of looking for prior red flags. Management, the policies are not worth the paper they're written on if management is not engaging with these employees and we don't have a good HR response to ensuring that these reasonable steps are taken and implemented at the ground level. The policies should emphasize proactive measures. And so if we're going to define zero tolerance behaviors, we need to be sure to define it exactly the way we wish the policy to be enforced. And if we do define a policy, or if we do define behavior, as a zero tolerance behavior, then the employer needs to ensure that the consequences are consistently enforced for violations of those policies. We do not want any sort of disparate enforcement here. If it's a zero tolerance policy, it needs to be treated as such. We need to ensure that employers implement the policies emphatically. The benefits of this are twofold. One, I think we addressed the employees' concerns about feeling that the employer is not taking reasonable actions to preclude the risk of workplace violence with those retail statistics that we talked about earlier. And then two, just so that they're effective in the case that a violent encounter does occur. I think that probably the best piece of advice here in terms of how we can be proactive is employee assistance programs. Violent encounters virtually always stem from personal issues such as substance abuse, family violence, financial problems, stress, and ensuring that employees have access to assistance programs that provide confidential, low cost or free counseling can help kind of nip those issues in the bud before they snowball into something more concerning. And in enacting these policies, employers should consult with their insurance providers, experts, and community resources. And so there are plenty of experts that have, prior police experience, prior military experience that can help the employer just start to implement, some of the controls that we've spoken about today in this presentation. And insurance providers often have policy suggestions as well. You want to ensure that your insurance covers these types of situations, which I think sometimes we think, of course it would, it may not. And so let's shift over from policies to record keeping. These policies, as I mentioned, need to be consistently reviewed and revised if necessary. And employers need to be sure that they document fraught situations and keep documentation of these records. And so all the red flag behaviors that we discussed earlier, we also need to document injuries, illness, accidents, assaults, and corrective actions as well. If you're on a work site that for some reason has a just cause standard for any sort of disciplinary action, having appropriate records of employees engaging in, for example, harassment may be a crucial piece of evidence to, demonstrating discharge. And it would be even better to say, here's our policy. We define harassment as such. Here are, 5 records of this employee engaging in increasingly intimidating behaviors, and, it resulted in his termination. And so record keeping is absolutely crucial. And once employers document information, then they need to take action if necessary. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill, and he's going to discuss incident response teams.
Thank you, Carissa. Actually, I'm going to pause for a second and answer a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A, and also just go back and comment on a couple of things that Carissa has covered. Because I don't want anyone to think that any of the policy issues that we've just gone over are going to be simple. I've been involved in writing no tolerance policies for weapons in the workplace from time to time, and you get a lot of employee pushback. And you get people claiming that they have constitutional rights to carry weapons on your private property, and you get people claiming that the constitutional rights as implemented in the particular states prohibit your policy. And so you need to be prepared to answer those kinds of questions with regard to your policies when you roll them out. So it's one of the issues where you're going to have to do a certain amount of research in order to express your policy appropriately and to respond to the pushback you get from employees about the policies. Once you do have a policy in place, it is absolutely crucial that you have training in place. Actually, Carissa, can we jump forward one slide? The reason that we want you to do this training goes back to the legal risks that Carissa covered earlier. Right? One of the things that we look for if you ever do have an incident in the workplace is whether you took all the reasonable steps to prevent them. Right? That's one of the ways that employers get into legal trouble in a case of workplace violence, is if there were signs that there was going to be an incident and the workplace didn't do anything about it. Right? So in addition to having policies, we really want you to have done a risk assessment like Carissa was talking about. Think about who's got access, whether they can pick up a weapon while they're there, whether there are people who are in particularly vulnerable positions. Right? If you've done background checks on people, and I mean criminal background checks here, not just credit checks, criminal background checks to see whether they've got a history of violence, and be familiar enough with your continuing employees to know whether they've developed violent tendencies in the 25 years that they've worked for you. Just because you did a background check on them 25 years ago isn't going to tell you everything you need to know. So it's really important that you do all employee training, and that training ought to include recognizing threats, and this includes recognizing policy violations. Right? So if somebody is coming to work with a rifle, right, or with a knife, people who are going to know that first are going to be the coworkers, not the supervisor, not the HR people. It's going to be people who are there working with that particular employee and see that in his car parked in the parking lot, assuming that you're in Colorado and not in Arizona, or if you're in his locker, that there's a weapon there. Right? Also, like Carissa was talking about, if these people are making specific threats. There was a case in the northwest of the country not so very long ago where the employee was speculating about what time of day would be the best time to ambush the supervisors coming onto the plant floor in order to have an effective attack. And at the same time, coworkers were reporting, oh, and by the way, he has weapons. We know because he talks about them all the time. So you want your employees to be trained in recognizing issues that need to be reported, and then trained in how to report them. I mean, obviously, you don't want them just whispering at lunch, hey, that guy's really dangerous, stay away from him. You want it to be reported up to HR so you can take appropriate action. Now, what that appropriate action is an interesting question, which is why de-escalation is there. You certainly want to train your employees in how to minimize conduct that would trigger people. Sometimes that's not all that needs to be done. Sometimes HR needs to intervene. In that case I was just mentioning in the Northwest, where the employee was speculating about when was the best time to attack the supervisors and had weapons, the head of HR, and this head of HR gets my award for the gutsiest head of HR, right, took the person who was making the threats aside, sat him down and said, "Can you promise me that you are not going to attack anybody?" To which the employee said, "No, I cannot promise you that." And so the head of HR walked that person off site and began an appropriate ADA evaluation to see whether the person was safe to have in the workplace or not. Turned out the person had a long-standing mental health issue. The medicines he had been on for the last 20 years had been perfectly effective, but it was on a new medication that was not so effective. So they had to get back on the right medication before he could come back to work. Right? But de-escalation has a lot of different functions. Sometimes it's just not triggering somebody, but often it's going to have to do with HR intervening in a dangerous situation and getting that person off site. Self-defense techniques. Okay, this is probably an area where you want to think about having an expert come in and do some training. Right? Do you really want to train your employees on how to disarm a threatening coworker? Probably not. You want to train them on evacuation procedures, how to get out of the building, right? How to hide, how to avoid confrontation in the first place. But there might be room for some kind of hands-on training with regard to avoiding a particular conflict. I don't know. It's going to depend on your setup and what kinds of things are available to you. Okay. Evacuation procedures, absolutely. Practice drills. There are a variety of different kinds of practice drills that are available to employers now. We have one client who brought in an expert who staged an active shooter situation in the work site in order to run all the employees through what they should do under this particular circumstances. The general advice, of course, was run, hide, fight, right there on the slide. Right? But doing it when there is the sound of gunfire in the background is a really different environment. Now, this is not to say that all employers need to do all of these things. That's what the risk assessment is for. Right? Assess whether your workplace is open to people just wandering in when they're not at work. Is it is susceptible to people coming in bearing a weapon? If it is susceptible, can you put up metal detectors? Can you put in a security door so that people have to be signed in? Is that going to interfere with your business? As most of you probably know, in Colorado, we recently had a grocery store shooting. Right? Very ineffective to put up barriers at the front of a grocery store and have everybody signed in by a worker and escorted the way you would in a high-tech facility if it's a grocery store. People are going to wander into grocery stores, and you need to evaluate how you want your employees to respond in those circumstances. Okay, Carissa, let's bump back a slide to the IRT. Now, one thing that we would very much like you to consider having in place is an incident response team. Sherman and Howard has incident response teams. They do not have to be the same as your security detail. In certain circumstances, you might have a security detail. You might have an off-duty cop who is there with a weapon. Or you might just have people who are part of the incident response team who are trained to recognize issues in the particular context. No, that's not just an employee blowing off steam. That's really a problem. Who are trained in how to report it so that if they see it or they find out about some kind of threat, they know how to report it to HR. We're trained in de-escalation techniques. This would be sort of an alternative to training all of your employees in how to take a weapon away from somebody. Might have a handful of people who have advanced degrees in psychology and some self-defense training who are taught how to talk to somebody who is distraught and apparently on the verge of doing something incredibly stupid. Right? Certainly you want to have people in the work site who are trained in first aid. And then trained in how to roll out warnings and implement lockdowns. This might be a subset of the incident response team. This might just be somebody on the HR team right? Who can say, okay, this is a serious enough situation that we're going to lock the doors and we're all going to hide under our desks and we're going to, lock the place down. When I started at Sherman and Howard, you used to be able to just wander into any floor of the office and there was, a receptionist right there, no matter which floor you walked into. Now we have locked doors. People can't just wander in. We've got a particular point of access. And so when we lock down, we can lock down much more effectively and much more quickly. We just close the doors and nobody comes in. And then you also want to have people who are trained in community resources and emergency contacts. Again, this is probably going to be somebody on the HR team, right? Somebody who knows who at the police department to call. Right? And when it is you need the EMTs to show up. And who do you refer a distraught employee to so that they have someone to talk to outside the workplace about what's going on in their lives? The EAP, for example, right? Or other kinds of family counselors. Really want to, I know it's very old school HR, I know, but you want to have somebody who's in close enough contact with the employees that you more or less recognize when they need to talk. And you need somebody in HR who can talk to them. That is a significant HR skill set. Not everybody in HR has it. Carissa, I think we've got one more slide in this set, right? Yeah. So I've got a question in the Q&A about OSHA. So two things. First of all, there is a House Bill 1195 presented that calls for the Department of Labor to present, to specify some rules for avoiding workplace violence in the healthcare setting. This is significant because it identifies the healthcare setting as one of the situations where OSHA in particular has usually regarded workplace violence as a particular threat. Healthcare is one of, I think, 3 areas where OSHA thinks you need to be especially wary of workplace violence. So the question in the Q&A was, first, is House Bill 1195 likely to pass? Frankly, I don't think so. It's not the first year it's been advanced. It was advanced previously, gets out of the House regularly, goes to the Senate, and dies in the Senate. We all know that many things die in the Senate. That won't, of course, stop the president from instructing the Department of Labor to issue rules. So we might get rules even without 1195. And then the follow-up question that we had in the Q&A about OSHA was, will OSHA cite a healthcare employer under the general duty clause? And the answer there is yes. OSHA could do that. OSHA's position has been, we're only going to cite employers in the industries we have identified as being particularly at risk. But healthcare is one of those industries. So it is possible that OSHA would cite a healthcare employer for failure to secure a safe and healthy environment. Does not happen much. I would frankly expect it to happen only after you've had an incident. That might be an occasion where OSHA comes in and wants to get all the other employers to pay attention to these things, and so cites an employer where there's been an incident. In any case, it's, I think, good practice, not just under OSHA, but under general principles of legal liability, and also just because we are good employers, to take all these steps we've been talking about. Okay? You want to make sure that you've done a risk assessment, you've done appropriate training, you have a response plan, and that you review those response plans from time to time. What does OSHA recommend? Well, OSHA thinks you ought to have a procedure in place to provide first aid and emergency care. So that was part of what we talked about with regard to the incident response team. We've added here free transportation off-site. So, if you've got somebody who needs to be taken to a suicide prevention clinic or who needs to be taken to a hospital, don't let their personal finances be a barrier to making sure they get the care they need. Right? Do not count on them being able to call an Uber, or them being able to pay for a cab, or them having a car. If they need care, make sure they get it. Call the ambulance yourself. And if there's an issue with paying for the ambulance outside of insurance, pay for it. Make sure these people get the care they need promptly. OSHA wants us to take action to prevent injury to others. Those are all the things we've been talking about. Right? Think about it in advance. Plan for what you're going to do in the case of an incident. Right? Train your people. Comprehensive treatment and psychological evaluations for traumatized workers. This again is after the incident, right? Once the incident has occurred, want to make sure that you are aware of the workers' compensation and emotional distress and post-traumatic stress syndrome that's going to come up. Some of these things are disabilities, and you're going to have ADA issues. Some of them are issues that need critical care and immediate treatment, and you want to be on the side of making sure everybody gets treatment, not on the side of, oh, gee, I'm not sure our insurance will pay for that. Right? Stretch the point to make sure people get treatment. The negligence standard is another source of risk with regard to the incident response, and I think we've covered that now. Post-incident investigations. Now, in many incidents, we're going to have the police conducting the post-incident investigation. Right? But you're also going to want to at least review the results of the police report, and you're going to want to give some thought yourself to what the root causes were and what you can do in order to improve the response the next time. Some kinds of violence come in waves. There are copycats who think, the right people weren't shot last time, so let's do this again. So anytime there's been an incident, you want to give some thought to what the training has covered, whether the policies need to be updated, right, what the root cause of this particular incident was, and how we might have known about it in advance, and whether we did, and whether we took appropriate action. So post-incident investigations should be part of your repertoire with regard to responding to workplace violence. Now, we do have another question in the Q&A, and it's, is one employee spitting on another considered a violent act? Right? Well, that's very specific, and we would need to know a whole lot of facts in order to try to evaluate whether that was a violent act or not. We'd want to know what the context was. Right? Was the spitting indicative of a broader conflict? Or was it just an immediate response to a particular act right that moment? Is it spitting because they harbor discriminatory attitudes towards people of that type, or is it because they were insulted? Right? Was it followed up with an entire rant? Right? We've certainly had cases where someone who has a reputation as a bully is threatening to take people outside and have a fight with them. Right? And if that's that person's frequent response to any kind of event in the workplace, that is something that HR is going to want to address. We'll say, by the way, I had a labor arbitration along these lines many years ago now, where we had a psychologist come in and testify as to how HR people ought to respond to workplace bullies. These are not people who were engaging in bullying as part of their sexual harassment of coworkers or as a racial harassment. They were just bullies. And I learned a lot about bullies, but we actually had a psychologist testify that if you have a bully in the workplace, the only effective recourse HR has is to fire them. Think about that, having an expert say, no, really, you needed to fire them. If that kind of expert testimony is out there and you know of a bully and you didn't fire them, we might have a negligence issue. Okay. So is an employee spitting on another considered a violent act? Depends on all the circumstances. It's also going to depend on your particular policy. I suspect all of you have a policy that says you're not going to okay, and Elizabeth agrees with me. It's unacceptable. Fire any bully in the workplace. So we're getting a little bit of discussion, just like I would have liked to have in person. Your policy ought to be a policy that covers all kinds of unprofessional conduct. And I would think that spitting would be a violation of one policy or another, and that appropriate disciplinary action should be taken. With that, let me turn it back to Carissa. I'm sure you've heard enough of me speaking here, and Carissa will take us out for the next few minutes here. If any other questions, please do go ahead and add them to the Q&A list. As you see, we'll try to address them as we go along.
Thanks, Bill. And then I'll add in, if for whatever reason this type of circumstance is isolated, document anyways, and sit down with the employee. As we talked about earlier, it's important to keep record of employee bad behavior. And so if for whatever reason the circumstances dictate that the situation doesn't warrant termination, although I agree with Bill and Elizabeth that it likely does, document it anyways. But moving on to the aftermath of a violent encounter. Obviously, there's going to be physical injury, but short-term and long-term psychological trauma and employees' fear of returning to work. There are many laws that overlap with these issues, the ADA, FMLA, workers' comp. These are all important considerations to take, important things to take into consideration. And then also beyond what's legally required, how does the employer want to facilitate these employees' recovery and growth so that they can move on from this circumstance and continue to live very full lives? So if the violent encounter occurs at work, sometimes the return to work can result in feelings of discomfort, changes in relationships between coworkers, and then the last two, feeling of incompetence, of guilt and powerlessness, and then fear of criticism by employers. I think we've all heard of, survivor's guilt. If the encounter is a violent encounter, I think it's fair to assume that many of these symptoms will be experienced by most, if not all, of the employees. And it's just as important to properly address the aftermath as it is to address the circumstance when it's happening. And so the appropriate way to address the aftermath is through the utilization of the resources. A great HR team that is on the ground level, involved with the employees, is probably one of the most important ways to respond immediately, ensuring that employees have access to all of the resources that the employer provides. The employees know that they can take the time that they need, and they're aware of other programs like the employee assistance programs or other benefits. I think time off is probably one of the most common ways that an employee may seek to kind of process what happened. If you were able to attend the Big Five or my wage and hour presentation this morning, then you know about the Healthy Families and Workplaces Act. I briefly discussed that the Healthy Families and Workplaces Act requires employers to provide paid sick leave, but it's not just limited to the common cough or cold. Employees should be allowed to use paid sick leave for reasons such as seeking legal help for domestic violence, or seeking medical help as a result of some sort of violent encounter. Those reasons are codified in the statute. And so it'll be important that employers ensure that employees understand that their paid sick leave, if it is, pursuant to HIFLA, should be used for those reasons. And I guess I'll note that even if you do have your own policy that you're attempting to use to comply with HIFLA, your policy has to allow employees to utilize leave for those reasons. But you may want to go beyond what's the minimum required by law and offer other types of leave for employees, paid or unpaid leave. Ensuring that employees have access to victims advocates, psychologists, and first responders who are responding to the actual event when it occurs. These resources can help an employer appropriately respond. And so lastly, I just wanted to touch on media coverage, because I think that, we all want to attend this presentation and do what we can to prevent violent encounters, not one just for the ethical obligation to provide a safe workplace, but the legal obligation to provide a safe workplace. And so on the media coverage, I'm just touching on a somewhat less, intuitive thought, is that how the employer responds, how the employer took actions to prevent violent encounters, how they respond, and what they do to empower their employees after will probably be reported in the media if it's a large event. And the media can show that the employer has come together with the community to rally around workers, or it could show that the employer was deficient in their preventative measures, response measures, or how they responded during the actual event. So that can exacerbate anxiety with employees, and it can also damage company reputation down the line. And so to be aware that not only do we want to do this to preclude legal risk and to provide and to fulfill the ethical obligation of providing a safe workplace, but also to ensure that there's no negative media backlash. And so at that, I think we've got questions. We've got about 5 minutes, Bill. I don't know if you have access to those, but.
I do have access to them, and I will watch them. But since we've got a couple of minutes, I've got a couple of back and fill points that I guess I would like to make. One is paid sick leave. Arizona's law also allows the use of earned paid sick leave for purposes such as responding to domestic violence and so on. So don't forget to, for those of you who are in Arizona, don't forget to include that in your thinking there as well. One other thing that I think we mentioned sort of in passing, but I wanted to dwell on for a moment is former employees. You know, one of the fraught issues that will bring violence to the fore is when you fire people. You fire people, they're going to think that they have been unjustly treated, and they might very well react violently. Okay. Now, some of our employers have done an assessment and have made the decision to have security on site and increased presence when they've been firing people. And you know, I've never, I think, ever told anybody it's a bad idea to have security on site. But I think you want to pay some attention when you are planning the firing process as to whether this person is someone who is a particular risk. So if you've been hearing that the person has weapons in their car, right, you're not going to want to have just the supervisor fire them. You're going to want to have an HR professional involved in the firing and making sure that you sort of assess that person and walk them off site and that they're calm when you leave them. Or else, if necessary, call the police. If you really think that there's a threat, have the security people come. The other point was, I don't want to say off premises, but out of the building. Right? So many employers have a private parking lot. Right? And long ago, we've had a workplace violence situation in the parking lot. It was a domestic situation. The woman employee's ex-boyfriend was waiting for her in the parking lot. Right? And so when you do your assessment, you want to also consider what's the situation in the parking lot. Is the parking lot well lit? Right? Are the employees going out to their cars in the dark, one by one, by themselves, such that they can, you know, they might be targeted in the parking lot? And if there is a particular risk factor there, you might think about how we might assess that. What kind of additional security provisions might we put in place to enhance security there? You know, long ago, Sherman and Howard adopted a policy where our associates could, actually the members too, I suppose, could ask our in-house security people to walk them to their cars if necessary. And, two other points. These are all old stories, I suppose. You know, 25 years ago when I started at Sherman and Howard, my first assignment was on a violence case, a wrongful death case. That arose from an employee's contact with a customer, where the employee, you know, essentially hunted the customer down and attacked her. Right? So these are long-standing issues, but ones that you want to be aware of, and you want to think about that when you're considering the information that your employees have about customers as well. This ties back in part to what Emily was saying in the morning session. Pay attention to what kind of information you are gathering and the reasons it can be accessed and how it might be used. Okay. Okay, I'm not actually seeing any other questions populating in the Q&A. If you do have other questions, you can download the materials with the materials button on the landing page, and that will include Carissa's and my contact information. Please feel free to contact us with questions about these things. Carissa, any closing remarks?
None from me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for participating very much. Certainly hope that we will have an opportunity in the future to all get together in person again, and that we can do these kinds of discussions in proper style, with you all telling us your best practices and your experiences in this area, and the kinds of training that you would want to give to your HR staff to make sure that they're able to address these issues. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.